We are going to start with Osseo Public Schools. But we've always done it this way. How good intentions perpetuate racial disparities in our schools. Thank you guys for joining us.
Well, good morning, everyone. Good morning, and thank you for being here with Courtney and I. And we are really excited and thankful to have the opportunity to share with you this morning a tool that we use. And I really believe that what we experienced just shortly ago with Dr. Hahn is going to really set up, really the foundation for what we'll be talking about, because what we believe is that it's very difficult to use what we're going to offer you, which is really what we describe as a technical tool to change behaviors without this adaptive framework or mindset that really Dr. Hahn provided us with this morning. So thank you, and we'll go ahead and get started, understanding that we have a very limited time, but I want to allow Courtney to introduce herself.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Courtney Caldwell. I am an equity teacher in the Osseo Area School District, which means that I was a classroom teacher, taught middle school Spanish for almost 10 years, and then moved into the world of being an equity teacher. So my primary responsibilities are working with teachers, administrators, district administrators, and to really isolate race in courageous conversations. I also work as a coach with the National Urban Alliance and do a lot of culturally responsive teaching methods and coach teachers as well. But my job on a daily basis is to say, how do we look at systems, instruction, policies, and really say what impact does race and white privilege have on the educational experience for our children?
Absolutely. So thank you, Courtney. And I realize I failed to introduce myself. My name is Osseo Area, and I'm one of the assistant superintendents in the Division of Leadership, Teaching, and Learning in the Osseo Area School District. So Courtney and I, we have 3 outcomes for our 20-minute time slot, which we realize that that's probably way too many. So as we've thought about it a little bit more, we'll try to provide a brief overview and throughout our conversation, give you some insight into some of these areas, but we're really going to try to focus most of our time around the third outcome, which is really this tool, right? This Maslow's Hierarchy of Needs that isolates race to examine assumptions, deepen understanding, and engage in next action thinking. So we'll really spend most of our time there, understanding that we have a very limited amount of time with you this morning. I think it would be disingenuous to try to share this tool with you without really providing a larger context of the framework in which we use this. So what I've displayed in front of you really is, I would say, a visual representation of our superintendent, Dr. Kate McGuire's vision around racial equity work. And the reason I start here is because this vision really provides us with gives us permission to do racial equity work and isolate race and talk about race in every single thing we do in the Osseo Area School District, but it also gives us the responsibility, right? So it gives us the permission and responsibility to really go deeper in examining our practices and changing outcomes for our students in the Osseo Area School District. And all it really talks about is that we have a collective set of practices, just as all of you in your school districts have a collective set of practices that you do over, extended period of time, because we know no one thing is going to solve a problem, in 1 year or in 1 month. And, Dr. Hahn really talked about this a little bit. She talked about this hearts and mind piece. So what we also believe is that it requires both technical and adaptive solutions, right? So we know that we would not be able to solve matters of racial disproportionality with just tools, right? That is going to also require us to have a modification of our mindset and our hearts. So with the combination of those two things, we believe that we're able to move our racial equity work forward in the Osseo Area School District.
So taking a look at this as a tool, so Maslow, trying to think about sometimes framing the conversation around race, racism, and white privilege to teachers can be challenging. So having an entry point and really taking Maslow's hierarchy of needs as a relevant way to engage in the conversation about how do we start changing and interrupting these practices and policies and programs that are harming our students, especially our students of color and our indigenous students. So took Maslow's hierarchy and just said, what if we isolated race within each level? So starting down at this physiological level and knowing that Maslow's hierarchy is really about if the basic needs or if the needs in one level aren't met, we can't move to the next level. So saying in this first level, and we believe at this first level that racism affects students systemically and personally. So we're talking about things like when our students, especially our students of color and indigenous students, come into the building as young scholars, the micro and macro aggressions that they face on a daily basis trigger stress in their young bodies. At that basic level, what's happening when the basic needs of students of color and indigenous students are marginalized? Differently than for that of our white students. If this is happening, think about Black Lives Matter. What's going on now? The effect that that's having on our students, especially our students of color, especially our Black students, and these basic needs. And if these basic needs are being challenged and are threatened for our students, how can they move to this next level of safety and really feeling safe and secure in our schools? Because this next level is all about feeling a sense of predictability and security within the school institution. And we believe at this level that racism affects a student's sense of safety due to bias. So Dr. Hahn was talking about unconscious bias. There's implicit bias, but bias exists in our institution. So it results in predictable outcomes for students of color and indigenous students. How safe can our students of color feel when how they're treated can be predictable based on the teacher that they encounter or the staff member that they encounter? We've all heard that students know if you like them or not. Students know if you care. And unfortunately for our students of color, they feel that on a different level because of bias. So if we want our students to feel safe, we first must need to make sure that their basic needs are being met. And how do we know that? Oftentimes in groups I'll say, "Look, this is a safe space." But can students really show up and be their authentic self if their basic needs haven't even been met by me? The next level then moving up is this love and belonging. So really looking at, do our students of color and our indigenous students feel connected within the institution? And this level really exposes a disconnect between whiteness or white cultural norms and those of students of color and indigenous students. And we were talking, and Dr. Hahn did a good job of saying that white cultural norms does not mean that all white people do the exact same thing. However, it's like that Times New Roman size 12 font. It just is what it is. It's the invisible culture of our schools, of our institutions. And if students of color, especially in our district and many districts, when we isolate Black males, don't fit into these white cultural norms, how are they othered? Where do we send them to? What systems and programs do we have in place that unintentionally other our students of color? Moving up to self-esteem. So we believe that at this level, racism can affect a student's way of being in all these different dimensions. Their knowing, their feeling, their doing, and how they think. Whose cultural identity is developed in a positive way in our institutions? Do we develop the cultural identity of our students of color and indigenous students from an early age in our institutions? And if we don't, how do we prevent feelings of superiority in our white students and feelings of inferiority in our students of color and our indigenous students? So to really be able to have a positive self-identity is crucial to be able to advance to this last phase, which is self-actualization. And we believe that at this level, institutional racism determines which students are given access to reach their fullest potential. So how do we define success in our educational institutions? If we think about high school, who's in our advanced placement courses racially? Who has the highest graduation rates? Who's attending four-year institutions? Who is self-actualized in our institution and who is not? So really using this as a tool to first say, we need to unpack each of these levels. And if our students of color, if we're isolating race, if our Black males are here or here, how do we expect them to be spontaneous and creative when their basic needs are stifled? So this is something that, again, Maslow developed this. All we did is say, what happens when we isolate race? And asking them to take us into this tool that's going to allow us to unpack these more.
Absolutely. So thank you, Courtney. And I want to really reiterate that, so the tool that we're getting ready to discuss right now and walk through with a fixed mindset or a limited amount of racial consciousness, okay, this tool will only allow you to produce the same results that you're currently getting. So I want to be very transparent about that, because what I don't want anyone to walk away with is saying like, oh great, I can take this document and we can try to use it with our team back at our site, and without a willingness or understanding that you can't change a problem with the same mindset that created it in the first place, right? You will ultimately end up getting the same results. So I think it's important to acknowledge that this framework that we're going to share with you really comes from the work, you heard the piece about Maslow's work, but it also comes from the work of Dr. Dennis Sparks, Leading for Results. Is anyone familiar with Dr. Dennis Sparks' work, right? So if you're familiar with this work, if you're familiar with this book, you understand that throughout this entire book, there's a bunch of different opportunities really that allow you to unpack your mental models or your beliefs. So it's the way we use it is really as a systems thinking tool. So in the Osseo Area School District, we really focus our racial equity work around what we call 4 different systemic racial equity tools. So in our district, we've chosen, you heard Dr. Hahn talk a lot about the IDI. Well, we've chosen to use courageous conversations about race, right? That provides us with a common language to be able to engage in conversation and be able to move racial equity work forward. We also use system thinking tools, right? And we have a whole set of different system thinking tools that we use, the iceberg, the ladder of inference, and this is just another tool that we use as we really start to explore our practices and in our schools that affect students on a daily basis. We also use adaptive leadership principles as well as a systems thinking tool. And towards the end, we'll talk a little bit about how that helps guide our thoughts and really our action in the work that we do. So as we look at this document, one of the things that I think is essential is that as you see this examining your assumptions piece, deepening your understanding, and engaging in next action thinking, we've started to use this with our equity team. So in our school district, at every single site and in most departments, we have what are called equity teams. And they're at the site level, it's a group of teachers, non-licensed staff, administrators that really come together and examine and explore the practices that are occurring in their building and determine how race is impacting the outcomes for students. And within those equity team meetings, we create space to use different systems thinking tools, right, to really look at the challenges that we're facing. And it's important that we start in this area or column of really examining our assumptions. So what we mean by that is that we all enter into the space with personal lived experiences based on race, right? So I see the world as a black man differently than Courtney sees the world as a white woman. And in order for us to move the work forward, we have to be transparent about how we see the world, right, wrong, or indifferent. So this tool really allows for individuals and teams to really unpack how they see the world. Now, this next piece around deepening your understanding has been, I would say, essential in our work, because this is really the piece around multiple perspectives. And we heard Dr. Hong talk about this. So the way we try to use this with our equity teams is we really try to push teams to not only think about engaging in multiple perspective at the school level, but multiple perspectives of family, community, okay, students, and how those perspectives are going to impact or even influence the thinking of the individuals in the school. Because as a principal, if I have a certain idea about how I can fix a problem, so let's just even use the example of, how am I doing on time, Courtney? 5 minutes, okay. So if I use the example of like nonviolent versus violent behaviors in school, so I'm assuming all of you are probably engaging in this, and if you're not, you probably will be thinking about, well, how do we solve this issue around suspension, right? Because across the state, we have significant disproportionality in the number of students being suspended, and students being suspended from everything from what is defined as disruptive behavior to bringing weapons to school. So in our school district, we've really started to examine, how do we define violent versus nonviolent, right? So examining your assumptions around what violent versus nonviolent looks like, okay? And then as we get into this piece around deepening understanding, not only taking our own understanding of what violent, nonviolent, disruptive, and really starting to look at what do all of these different things mean, and why are we using this particular strategy to change that behavior? You know, we've gone as far as inviting community members and, you know, using a sort of a framework of this tool to engage and help us deepen our understanding through their personal lived experiences of what happens when we apply certain practices on their children to try to change their behavior, right? So the first and second column there really allow us to engage in what we call next action thinking. The important piece about next action thinking is that what you may develop or come up with may not necessarily work right away. It may require some modification, but what we've learned is that it's gotten us to a place not to just use the same old practices that we've always used because we're comfortable with it and because it's what feels best to us. You know, oftentimes in my leadership, I did things that I felt that were most comfortable to me, not taking into consideration the impact that it had on students and families that I served. And when I'm able to start seeing perspectives and hearing perspectives, and as Dr. Hahn talks about this heart and mind piece, feeling the personal lived perspectives of those that we serve in the Osseo Area School District, it influences me around the next action that we're taking. So what we wanted to do is just offer you this tool as a place to begin conversations and think about how you can look at and examine some of your practices and policies and really determine if they're meeting the needs of the populations that you serve. And not to be afraid of engaging in next action thinking and doing something and it may not work. You know, one of the things that we talk about in our school district is what happens when you crash into one another. And we use that language intentionally because we're gonna do things around racial equity that might not work, right? It just might not work. And then we have to pick ourselves up, pick each other up, brush each other off, and being able to use common language, stay in communication with each other to figure out how we continue to move the work forward, because what we're unwilling to do is continue to get the same results that we've gotten using the same strategies that we've gotten. So Courtney, do you want to add anything around this piece? Would you mind advancing me to the last slide? And I think I probably have 1 minute. So as I talk about one of our systemic racial equity tools, we really think about a lot of our work, and actually started us here as I talked about that framework that Dr. McGuire really set the context of our racial equity work in, is this adaptive leadership piece. Ultimately, we understand that because of how polarizing matters of race and racism are in our country, is that traditionally, you know, whenever you get ready to do work around racial equity, you know, you have the ability, right, to push people out of what is called their limit of tolerance. And in order to be able to maintain, okay, and keep people within this productive zone of disequilibrium, we've found that it's important to have common language, right? Because if you're able to engage with each other around a set of common terms and understanding, it allows for people to be able to maintain themselves in this productive zone of disequilibrium. But it's another thing that we found is that creating this place of making it okay to make mistakes. And I know in dealing with matters of race, making mistakes don't always feel right, because we understand how significant that is and what it can do for relationships. But what we've tried to do is say that it's not okay to be the same as we are, and that we have to move forward. So because of that, okay, we have to be able to, be okay with making mistakes and support each other through that. And I would also add that one of the challenges that I found for myself personally is that when you're in this productive zone of disequilibrium, that's maintaining and being able to stay within that productive zone. And that's where these type of tools really help and allow to keep moving the work forward. So Courtney, I saw you getting ready to add something to that, or?
So we have 20 seconds.
Oh, 20 seconds, all right. Well, you know what, I'm actually proud of myself, because I thought there was no way we were gonna get all of this in 20 minutes, but hopefully there'll be an opportunity towards the end for us to ask questions and engage with each other. So thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you. so much for presenting.